Hey guys, today I'm going to talk about family and the role that family can play in our mental and emotional health and the impact that the past can have on the future today. And I'm sure we've all been in that moment where we think to ourselves, I can't believe how much I'm becoming like my mum or my dad. Maybe it could be the things that you say, the way you dress, your political sense, your views on the world, the way you view parenting. When you're younger, you said, I'm never going to be like them. And then suddenly you find yourself, however many years later, becoming them and morphing into them. And it's quite scary. My sister's been pulling out photos recently, and she's pulled some photos out of my dad when he was my age. And my nephew actually said to her, Mum, who is that person with Uncle Jim? Because, gradually we can change. Gradually we become more and more like our dads, like our mums. And it's not just in a physical way, but often in an emotional way and in a spiritual way as well. And whether we like it or not, our families have a huge impact on us. Our families have a huge impact on the way we think, the way we do things, the way we react to situations, and also on our emotional intelligence and our mental health. Curtis Cluett, a brilliant author. If you haven't read 4G, I encourage you to go and get it by him. And he said this. He said, I'm talking about different generations. He said, our lives are not islands with defined coasts. Basically, what he's saying there is, we're not completely separate from our family. We sort of blur into them. We're not a separate island. A lot of what our families did and have done, it blends into making us who we are. We're not distinct. Our families have a massive impact on us. A couple of years ago, I read a book by Oliver James, the top-rated child psychologist, and he wrote a book called Not in Your Genes. And he talked about the impact that parents can have on their children. And he took politicians, celebrities, sportsmen, all as his case study to show how the impact that their parents had on their lives, both positively, but also negatively. And the great thing about that book, even though it's quite a negative book in many senses, he does say there is still hope for us, that we don't have to make the same mistakes of our parents. Because it was scary, the stories that he told, where children were making exactly the same mistakes as their parents were making. And the patterns just seemed to flow down families. And in the Bible, we see this again. We see the impact that families have on the future generations. We see the impact they have both mentally, psychologically, relationally with each other. So take a classic example, Abraham, who's revered by so many different faiths in the world as being sort of the main man of God who kickstart a lot of the great monotheistic faiths. And with Abraham, he had a few issues. Now, what Abraham did was Abraham was promised a child by God. It didn't come with his wife. So what he did was, as he got older, he slept with his wife's servant. So she had a son called Ishmael. Now, this caused a problem between Hagar, the servant who he slept with, and Sarah, his wife. And there's friction. And it's caused a bit of friction between him and Sarah at times as well. But then Sarah fell pregnant, so she had a boy and called Isaac. Now, Isaac and Ishmael, they had tensions between them because of Abraham's actions. And this went on. So there's tensions in his marriage, and there's tensions between his sons. So what happened was eventually Jacob, the younger son, he is the one, Isaac, even the younger son, better get it the right way around, gets God's blessing. And he said, you're going to take Abraham's line down. So the younger son gets the favor for in a better way. So you got the younger son getting the favor. You got brothers disagreeing, arguing. We've got a problem in the marriage. Next generation, Isaac goes and gets married. He marries Rebekah. He has two sons, Esau and Jacob. What happens with Esau and Jacob? They grow up fighting and competing for each other. But the problem was, Jacob was favored by his mum. So when his older brother was supposed to go and get the oldest one's birthright, blessing, she conned her husband, who was going blind at the time, into blessing the younger son, Jacob. And he received the blessing. What do we have here? Second generation, where we have problems in the marriage, problems between brothers, and the youngest being favored. Then we skip down in the next generation. Jacob, He then has a couple of wives. A lot of issues with his wives. He favours Rachel. He had to marry her older sister Leah first. He goes and sleeps with his servant girls. He has lots of kids. Joseph is the youngest boy. What happens? Jacob favours Joseph because it's his son with his favourite wife. Relations between the brothers break down. Relations between his wives break down. If you look into Genesis, you see the stories there. And what happens? The brothers don't like the fact that Jacob favours the youngest brother, Joseph. History repeating itself over and over again. To cut a long story short, Joseph's brothers pretend to have killed him, and they tell his dad he's dead when really they've sold him into slavery. And he ends up in Egypt. He ends up being prime minister, and he ends up meeting his brothers again after so many years. And when we come to Genesis 45, we see Joseph has to make a decision. He has to make a decision about whether he's going to forgive his brothers or he's going to sit and follow the next generation follow the mistakes that have been made previously in his previous generations. And Joseph did three things, and I'm going to explore them later on in the video online on YouTube and on the sermon on the website. So connect in if you want to understand this more. But he did three things in Genesis 45. He faced reality. He's honest about the situation with his family. He chose to forgive, and he looked to the future, and he changed the future. And when me and my wife, when we had kids, we discovered that there's a few family issues going on. I'm sure you all know about them. As you get older, you discover family skeletons, etc. And relationships that were broken in the families and all sorts of problems that seem to be recurring. And we said to ourselves this: we can look at our family destructive behavior and we can continue that behavior. We can do it either subconsciously or consciously, and then let that travel down to the next generations and have a huge impact on both their mental health and their mental well-being. Or we can choose to live a different path. We can choose to live differently and make a difference for the future. And we set aside, we did some stuff, we did some searching, which I'm going to share about in a minute, but we decided that our children's well-being and our children's health and our own mental health needed us to change direction and to live differently from how the previous generations had lived. Now, not everything they did was bad, so please, I'm not criticizing my family, just they've fallen humans. So we had to change direction. And I believe if we want to grow with our mental health and our emotional health, often we have to go back to our family and look at the things, the patterns that need to be broken before we can move forward. So, how do we do that? You see, Joseph in Genesis 45, I think he had planned revenge on his brothers. You see, what had happened was, a quick recap, his brothers had sold him into slavery. They were jealous of him because he was his father's favourite. He got given a fancy coat and they didn't. It was a bit of a silly little spat. You know, when siblings compete with each other. And it grew and grew and grew. It grew to this fact that they wanted to kill him. They didn't have the guts to kill him. So instead, some slave traders were passing by. So they flogged him to the slave traders. Now, I'm sure at times, I'm the youngest. I was a bit of a brat at times in my family. And I'm sure there's many times that my brothers and my sister would have quite fancied selling me into slavery, but they never quite went through with it. So obviously the family breakdown here of Joseph was quite extreme. He ends up getting picked up by Potiphar, who is a nice guy in Egypt who buys him as a slave. And Joseph does an incredible job. And Potiphar promotes him to a great place in his household. But Potiphar's wife likes Joseph. And Joseph was a really moral guy. And she wanted to sleep with him, and he said no. So she cried rape. And he ends up getting put in prison for something he didn't do. So he's in a really bad place, okay? He's been sold into slavery by his brothers. He's been falsely imprisoned for a charge that wasn't true. And then while he's in prison, he interprets some dreams. Eventually, one of Pharaoh's servants gets out of prison. He had his dream interpreted. And he says to Pharaoh, there's a great guy in prison who can help interpret your dreams. Cut long story short, I know it's more complicated than that. So Joseph ends up coming up to Pharaoh, and he says to Pharaoh, Pharaoh, I know what your dreams mean. You're going to have 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. And God's telling you that you need to prepare. Now, Pharaoh's blown away by Joseph. He is, wow, this guy seems to be interpreting my dreams that I didn't understand. He's got this message from God. He's clearly a good guy. So he makes Joseph prime minister. So Joseph goes from being highly respected, a brother who's loved, to being sold into slavery. And then he ends up in prison of false charges. And suddenly he's pulled up and projected to being prime minister of the Egyptian empire to help get them through a famine. So things are going pretty well for him compared to where it was before. Now, as a result of the famine, all the countries that were surrounded Egypt were coming to Egypt to get food because they were suffering the same famine. And Joseph's brothers eventually end up coming to ask for food. Now, Joseph spots his brothers, but they don't recognize him. Why should they recognize him? They sold their brother into slavery. They don't know where he's gone to. The last thing that will be on their mind is their brother, who they sold into slavery, would be leading the country of Egypt, or at least leading in a political sense. And Joseph has to face them. Now, Joseph does few things to test them, but eventually he sticks a silver cup in one of their bags, and he gets them arrested, falsely arrested, brought back to him, and he says, "Why have you guys stolen from me?" Now they still don't know it's Joseph. And Joseph is standing in front of them. He's set them up. He is one of the most powerful person below Pharaoh in the country. He can have these guys executed or locked up, his brothers. He has got the perfect revenge moment. You know when someone really hurts you and then you get them and you've got them on the hook and you're like, I've got my choice about what I'm going to do. It's like a James Bond moment when James Bond can kill someone or let them go. And Joseph has them. He's got them arrested and he's there. And he has to decide, what am I going to do? Am I going to punish them, or am I going to let them live and I'm going to forgive them? You know, there came that moment when he had to make a decision about whether he was going to change the course of history for his family or whether he was going to continue the feuds that the brothers had had in previous generations in his family. And Joseph, he did something quite incredible, actually. That moment was powerful. And this is what it said. He says in Genesis chapter 45, verses 1 to 2, it says, "He was alone with his brothers when he told them who he was. Then he broke down and wept. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians could hear him, and word of it quickly carried to Pharaoh's palace." You know, for years, Joseph had been holding on to emotional turmoil. His mental health. Can you imagine if you went through all the things that he'd gone through? Imagine how you'd feel. And at that moment when he started speaking to his brothers, when he started opening up and talking to them, it was like this huge release happened. It was a powerful moment. It was an emotional moment. And in that highly charged moment, he goes on to explain that God had a plan. Personally, I don't think that God had a plan to harm Joseph and sell him into slavery. I think God just used the harm that was caused to Joseph to bring something good. And he invites his brothers, though, to come down to Egypt to live with him. And it says this in verse 15, Genesis 45, verse 15. "Then Joseph kissed each of his brothers and wept over them. And after that, they started speaking freely with him." You see this powerful moment where Joseph, the years of hurt of his family, all come to this one moment. And he forgives them and he embraces them. And I believe there's some stuff that we can learn from Joseph here. And the first thing is this. Number one, we need to face reality. You know, when Joseph spoke to his brothers, he was like, "I'm the brother you sold in slavery. I'm the brother you did this to. I'm the brother you did that to. I'm the brother." He faced reality. He didn't pretend that everything was perfect. It wasn't like, "Oh, it's so good to see you, brothers. Oh, let's give a hug." He actually faced up to what they'd done. He faced up to the reality of the fact that he had been sold into slavery. He knew his brothers weren't perfect, and he didn't pretend they weren't perfect. And he made them face up to what they'd done, but also he faced up to reality. He didn't try and gloss over it to say, oh, it was all perfect, don't worry about it, I had a great time in prison. He was brutally honest with them about the hurt. You know, sometimes we need to face up to reality. Sometimes we need to face up to reality that happened in our families. Not just what we think we saw, not just what some people in the family told us happened, but actually face up to the truth of how our families have affected us. And Joseph did that. Now, I imagine for Joseph, when he faced up to the reality of what happened to him, he probably also had to face up to the reality of the fact that he was a spoiled brat. He was the youngest. His father doted on him. He got more than his brothers. He may have struggled with that, but I can imagine he would going around a little bit lippy, like, haha, look at me. I'm the chosen one. Sort of going around. And he did actually say that to them. You know, I'm the little one of my family. I'm the spoiled brat. Okay. I'm the one who could go around a little bit lippy. So I have a lot of sympathy for Joseph. Okay. Imagine, I said earlier, imagine my siblings would want to get rid of me a few times. But in my life, I have faced issues with my family. And those who know me close will know some of the big issues that I've faced and things I've struggled with. But there came a moment when I had to face up to reality that not everyone in my family was perfect, that we were all fallen, that we'd all harmed relationships, and that I was also part of the problem. Now, I just want to just stop here for a minute and just say that if you've suffered abuse as a child, or you suffered trauma for some adults, that is not your fault. I'm talking just about relationships as we grow up and as an adult. And I realized that I wasn't perfect. You know, I listened to Mark Stibbe and Todd White many years ago. Both of them share the same thing, where they both said in their family relationships, they had to learn to apologize even when they were younger, because they couldn't keep blaming everyone else for their problems. They had to face up to the problems that they caused as well in their family. That's hard. That's not easy. And for someone like me, you know, I find that really, really tough. I've got to swallow my pride and say, I'm sorry. I hate saying I'm sorry. But when I faced reality, when I faced what was really going on, I could start dealing with the issues. You know, Pete Scazzaro, who writes Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, says this. He talks about this in great depth, looking at the family genomes. And so looking at family tree and basically working out the divorces, the breakdowns in relationships, the suicides, the deaths, the controlling behavior. I did that for my family and sort of the relationships. And it was scary to see the relationships that were repeating themselves, the same habits that were repeating themselves. And then I looked at some of those and I looked at them in my own life and I thought, wow, I'm repeating the same mistakes that other people have repeated in my family. Now, I had to make a choice, and Naomi did it for herself as well. And we both had to make that choice and say that we can't make these mistakes again for the next generation, because all we're going to do is create what happened with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob, and with Joseph. That pattern will keep going down. So we had to say, we need to face reality, but we need to do something about it. We can't just say, oh no, that's just what my family's like. We had to then say, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to actively change the course? Because if we didn't, it was going to have an emotional effect. And I'd probably end up paying a fortune on counsellors and psychiatrists for my kids as they get older. And I didn't want that for them. So we deliberately, after facing reality, thought, we need to do something different. And I love what Joseph does here. Because as well as facing reality, the next thing that Joseph had to do was this, to receive breakthrough in this family situation, to help him, I think, emotionally and mentally, is he had to forgive. Now, forgiveness is a choice. I'm going to share more about it next week as well, about forgiving other people. But forgiveness is an act. You know, for years, I carried major unforgiveness in my family. I hated some of the circumstances that had put me in the place that I found myself. I was really angry young person. When I came to Jesus extremely broken. And I felt at the time like I was an innocent person who got caught up with a family that was messed up. Now, I love my family, just to clarify, and this is no way derogatory to them. This is how I felt. But the worst bit for me is this. I didn't realize it at the time. I was so busy blaming everybody else that I didn't see my own weaknesses. And it was only when I started choosing to forgive them that I started seeing that I needed forgiveness myself. You see, problem with unforgiveness is unforgiveness builds up really bad mental illness. I really mean this now. Okay, it builds up cycles of thinking. It builds up with anxiety. It builds up depression. It manifests itself physically. It can drain you. And you need to learn to forgive like Joseph did. Now, I don't know about you, but I have never been sold into slavery. I've never been falsely accused and put into prison. But Joseph had all those things, and he still chose to forgive his brothers. He still chose to do things differently, to break the family patterns. You know, when you realize that your family are human and that God died for your family as much as he died for you on that cross, for their forgiveness as much as yours, and that they were probably trying their best when they made mistakes, but they're a result of their situation and their background as well. That's when you start forgiving. Because you start to put yourself in their shoes. And that's really, really hard to do. But if we want to move on with our relationships and not let our family past and our family rubbish affect our mental health and our emotional well-being now, then we have to face realities of what's gone on in the past. And then we have to forgive them. We have to say, you know what, I choose to forgive. I choose not let them off the hook necessarily. Forgiveness is not necessarily off the hook. It's letting you off the hook ultimately. But rather than hold unforgiveness and resentment, you can start to say that I don't want to let the past hold me back. I don't want to let unforgiveness hold me back. Instead, I want to forge a new future into the new future for my family. And when we forge a new future, which is a third thing I believe Joseph did here, is we start saying we're going to choose a different path to how everything's gone before us. You know, it changes our perspective. When me and Naomi said that we don't want to repeat our family mistakes, what we're not saying is we don't love them, we don't respect them, or they're bad people. What we're saying is we want to keep the good, but we want to change the bad. Because, you know, we don't want some of the impact that had happened on ourselves. And some of it is bigger, some of it is smaller. Some of it has bigger impacts than you ever realize, and impacts different for different people. But we wanted it to be different for our kids, to create a better future for tomorrow, and not just say, when I was young, do you know what happened to me? When I was young, you know, when you were young, it's a different world. And we want to create a glorious future for our kids. We don't want to live in the past. You know, when we forgive, when we release, when we face the future, it gives us a chance to forge. So face the past even, gives us a chance to forge a new future. I'm sure you've heard of the story of the two alcoholic twin brothers. And what happened was two twin brothers with an alcoholic father. And the one twin brother becomes an alcoholic, and he says, the reason I'm an alcoholic is obvious, is because I had no choice. Things were formed. I saw what happened to my dad and I just followed him. The other twin brother never touches a bit of alcohol in his life, and he says, well, it's only natural I'm not going to drink because I saw what happened to my father and I couldn't follow him. You know, we have that same choice of whether we follow the sins of our fathers and the mistakes of our parents and our mums and our uncles and our aunts and our family, or whether we break it and say, no, enough is enough. I am a new creation in Jesus Christ. I want to live differently and I want to start again. I need to break it. You know, Naomi and myself are trying to do this. It's really, really tough. We are trying to forge the new low future, to get rid of the rubbish and take forward the good. And it's tough because, you know what, we're still victims. I don't like using that word, but we're still a result of the past and what was put into us. And we have to actively seek to live differently. And we're at the stage now in our relationship and actually in our family where we will look at each other when we react in certain ways and we will say, why did you react like that? And after I've complained and said, oh, shush and complain everything else, I have to say, you know what, it could have been because of this. and I look at something in my past and say, you know what, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. Naomi, I had to say to Naomi when I say to her sometimes, the way you're reacting is not right. Why? Why have you reacted this way? And then she'll look at it and say, you know what, the reason I reacted is because of this circumstances. And it's hard, because it's meant that we've had to face parts of our lives that we never wanted to face. But if I want to be emotionally stable and have good emotional and mental health in today's world, then what I've got to do is I've often got to get back in my family and say, what impact is my family having on me today? And once I've done that, I need to forgive them. I need to work through that. And then I need to forge a better future for them.